Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, we will learn about Agro Connection, a Brazilian information and education group. Our guest is Carlos Pires. Agro Connection bills itself as an international information portal that connects people who want to push the frontiers of knowledge about agriculture. Agro Connection's award-winning podcast has over 9,000 downloads of 37 episodes. In less than 2 years, its YouTube videos have reached 4,600 subscribers and nearly 200,000 views. Carlos Pires is one of the founders of Agro Connection. He is a native of the state of Rio Grande do Sul in southern Brazil. He recently received his PhD in agronomy and soil science at Kansas State University, and this summer he will begin his professional career at North Dakota State University. Agro Connection recently organized a Brazilian agriculture tour for the Kansas Agricultural and Rural Leadership Program. Carlos, welcome to the program.
Hey, Aaron. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk a little bit about our extension, education, and research program.
Yeah, this is the podcast episode about a podcast, and it's an interesting story. The connection between you and K-State, we'll get to that in a little bit. But why don't you start and just tell us about your background, how you started in Brazil and ended up here in Kansas?
Well, for me to decide what kind of a degree I wanted was easy. So most of my family, when I say most, is about maybe 80%. So they are all agronomists. Mm-hmm. I have two young brothers, and they are also agronomists. So actually, one is still pursuing his degree, and my middle brother Marcos, so he is in Illinois doing his master's in soil science as well, with a K-State alumni. So there's a lot of K-State connections everywhere. So that was an easy decision for me. So when I was 13 years old, I left home to go to a vocational school focused on agriculture and livestock. And I was also playing soccer at the same time. So my mom made a decision for me. So she said, you're going to go to college instead of play soccer. And I thanked her every day for that. So this is a pretty common thing in Brazil. You always need to make a decision whether you want to play soccer or you want to go for degrees, and so that's what she did for me, and I'm very thankful.
It's either or. You're going to get a degree or be a professional soccer player. Is that kind of
like being a soccer player in Brazil is hard. So there are many players, so competition is high. But anyway, so I went to college after that, and I got my master's in soil science as well, and decided to come to Kansas because I met a professor from K-State back in Brazil, Chuck Rice, and I was so impressed with his work in the area of soil health.
Is it common for 13-year-olds to go to a vocational school in Brazil?
It depends where. So in our state, it is. So my dad, he works in a co-op. So the co-op provides some funds if you want to go to a vocational school, because the co-op is focused on agriculture, as long as you do your internship at the co-op. So that was how it went for me. And a lot of people from my family, so they went to vocational school as well. It was hard because 13, imagine, right? Yeah. So I'm living with, I think it's 275 other students from Monday to Friday, and then on Friday we'd go home. It is very common in Rio Grande do Sul since we are an ag state, right? Mm-hmm. Pretty similar to Kansas. So it kind of is, yeah. If you want to go for agronomy in the future, if you have some interest in agriculture, that's kind of what people try to do.
That's fascinating. A lot of your family being agronomists. I think you told me that your family immigrated from Italy in the late 1800s. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep.
So who was the first agronomist? Have you traced that back?
Never thought about that, but I think his name, probably Clovis. That's his name. So he was the first one still in Brazil working as an agronomist. Probably he was the first one, I think, to get a college degree from my family.
You told me once that a lot of Brazilians dream about getting their education in the United States, and I think, well, that's great. That's very, very flattering. But why is that?
So, a couple reasons. First one is the language. So it's a great opportunity to learn English, which is the most spoken language in the world. Mm-hmm. So there's a great opportunity there, and also because when you go to college in Brazil, you're going to see that most of the information was developed in the US back in the days. And most of the professors, they got their at least a PhD or a master degree in the US. Of course, you want to do something similar to the ones that are doing great, right? And that's one of the reasons. So also because the US is king, is a world leader in agriculture. So Kansas specifically gave me the opportunity to work with different crops, and actually the crops that we had in my home state, which is wheat, corn, and soybean,
right, and
a little bit of sorghum as well. So there's a lot of similarities there.
Before we get into Agro Connection, let's talk a little bit about your home state. I mean, that is probably the primary area for wheat production in Brazil.
It is.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so, what type of wheat are they growing in Rio Grande do Sul?
Well, spring wheat for sure.
Spring wheat for sure.
So we don't have the
winter.
The winter there. So yeah, so mostly spring wheat, and that fits very well in the rotation because the main crop, of course, is soybean. And then we sometimes do the rotation with corn, depends on the price, of course. And then in winter, so we have a little bit of canola now. We're not there yet, and wheat, depending on the price and in the year, is the main crop in the winter. So fits very well in the rotation.
Well, you said you ended up at K-State because of Chuck Rice. Did you meet him in Brazil?
Yeah, so he was. He had a job appointment at the Federal University of Santa Maria. For a while. So my master's advisor, so he had a partnership with K-State. So he would come to K-State to teach about tropical ag, and then Chuck would go down to teach a little bit about agriculture in temperate climate and also about climate change. So Chuck Rice got his Nobel Prize with the IPCC on climate change. So he's very well known in the world about that, about climate change and soil health. So he was there teaching a class, and then I was just watching that. I couldn't understand a word. So that was 2016, maybe 15. I couldn't really understand any word, but I was there, right? So I was trying to make connections, and it worked. So I actually emailed Chuck, and he said that would be great to have me here, and I got here, and I couldn't ask for water. In 2017. So
well, your English is very good for not having understood a word in 2000.
I've been working on that.
Yeah, I could not do the same thing with Portuguese. So how long were you in the States before you thought about the podcast Agro Connection?
So I got here 2017, and then we had the pandemic. So I go to Brazil every single year to meet my grandparents.
Sure.
You know, life is hard to predict. So whenever I can't go to Brazil, I go. Because of the pandemic, I couldn't leave the U.S.
Yeah.
So I went to Florida with a couple of friends, and then good things happen when you're drinking beer, usually.
Yes.
So I was provoked. Why don't you start a podcast about soil science? And then a couple of days after that, we had a podcast. I'm very, I like to take risks, and I'm very motivated. So I invited a friend with a different mindset than mine. Mm-hmm. So that was I think it was a key thing for the podcast. If I'm more going kind of to the right, so he's going to the left, and then we're trying to meet halfway, right? So it worked very well, and I think we're doing great.
So you knew it was going to be a podcast about soil science, but what was the angle? I mean, who is your audience going to be?
So that's a good point. Because the podcast is not about soil science, right? So the podcast is about agriculture in general. And the goal there was to connect Brazilian and American agriculture. So the first thought was, what can I do in terms of podcast that still is something that Brazil didn't face yet? So what will be new? And then so this colleague, which is Rafael, so he works for BASF now. He was a PhD student back in the day. So he did part of his PhD in France. So he also went to Spain for a while. So he had some connections in Europe, and I had the connections in the US. So we worked together to take information from Brazilians that are all over the world and take that information back to Brazil. So we wanted to contribute in some way. Back in the day, I didn't know for sure if I wanted to stay in the US or if I wanted to go back to Brazil. So I want to make sure that I was still doing something for my country. That's how it started. So there's a lot of Brazilians everywhere. At K-State, we have many Brazilians. So what we were doing is just to connect them with the farmers and ag consultants in our country.
So you leveraged the connections, the Brazilians you knew around the world, around the United States.
Yep.
Your information gatherers, you would in turn use that podcast to educate Brazilian farmers.
Yeah, so that was the goal. So we have a lot of good information here in the US and in Europe as well, and Australia, New Zealand, for example. It's hard to record podcasts with them because of the time zone.
Sure.
It's really hard. But there's a lot of good information out there that we can take back to our country. So that was the main goal. So the idea was communication, because I have a passion for that. So my dream was always to find a position as a professor in research and extension. And the podcast was just part of that, right? That was a way I found to be connected with farmers in my country. And I guess we were being successful with that.
Do you remember what the topic of the first podcast was?
Yeah, so it was agriculture in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one was wheat in Kansas, because Rommel actually was the first, Dr. Lado. So he was the first podcast that we recorded, but he was the second because it was published after the...
Yeah.
So we just switched pretty much.
He brags about that. He was the first guest on this podcast.
He was the first guest. Both. Yeah, that's true. And the first podcast that we published was with Geomar, that you met in Rio Grande do Sul.
Mm-hmm.
So he is a K-State alumni. So he is the director of research for the CCGL, the co-op that we visit in Rio Grande do Sul.
So what happened after the first podcast was published? What was the response?
It was pretty good. I remember, if I remember well, I think we got 200 downloads in about 2 weeks in a new podcast. So that was very good for the Brazilian standards. But we were very new, I remember, because I always think like I can do whatever I want to do. And then we were just coordinating to have the podcast. And then actually a couple minutes before we start recording, it was, oh my gosh, what do I need to do? So we didn't have like good microphone. We didn't have like software. So it was a Zoom call that we recorded. We improved a lot after that.
When did you realize this was going to become a thing? I mean, you were going to continue to do this.
I think when a lot of colleagues, they started to text me to say how great it was. And mainly because there's a lot of podcasts, but not coming from researchers, I guess, because we have that passion for communication and education. We were kind of trying to translate the theoretical science into practice, and that's on our heart. So everything that we use for the podcast is pretty much based on research, and we want to convert that in a kind of simple language type of thing. Mm-hmm. And then we had a lot of other PhDs and other professors using that material in the classroom. So that was when so I think we're doing a good job. Our audience is not necessarily only farmers, but a lot of students as well that are still pursuing their degrees. So that was when we decided to, keep going, because we didn't know how long it would last, but we're still doing that.
How did you come up with the name, and why is it in English?
That's a good point. So we had a list of maybe 10, 15 different names. We didn't have ChatGPT back in the day to give you ideas about names. We had a list, so we created like a poll so people could vote, and I sent to a couple of friends, to family. We had many options, and then that was, I think, number one, if I'm not wrong, which was a very good name for the purpose of the podcast. And honestly, that was the other names, they were not related to Connection. They were like more ag stuff. Mm-hmm. And then, I need to say thank you to God because he got probably the name that would fit the best.
Did you have the vision at that time that it was going to become more than a podcast?
Yes. That was always our goal. So now we had that vision before, and the way we designed our logo. So I did the logo. I had a little bit of knowledge on Adobe Illustrator, and so we started to do the logo, and then I saw that globe that I could use because it's the world connection, and I think it was a very good fit at that point.
No, it's a great name. So how often did you do the podcast, and how did you distribute it? How did you promote it?
So the podcast is actually a hobby. So I have my professional career here at K-State, and in the future at North Dakota State University. So we try to record 2 episodes a month, not more than that. So we recorded last year for a while 3 episodes per month, but I do that after 5 p.m. every day, 5 p.m. CST, and maybe on Saturdays if you are recording with someone from Europe. And we promote through Instagram, not much on Twitter or X, because Brazil, X is used for different things. It's more like a social media for people rather than like professional things. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of noise in there. I think here as well, but a lot more there. So you see a lot of kids using, for example, X, and here in the US my feeling is kind of more like professionals using that. So that's how we do. So my research here was all on-farm at K-State. So I helped to develop on-farm research network focused on soil health. I wanted to record some videos while I was in the field to talk about the American growing season, corn, soybean, wheat. And the idea was to post that on Instagram to help to promote the podcast. And then another friend came in. So when I was in Weber, it's North Kansas, I wasn't at the Lovewell State Park.
Mm-hmm.
We were in a cabin there, and Alex Rosa, which works at Bayer in Gothenburg and the Learning Center. So he said, why don't you put the videos instead of Instagram on YouTube?
Yeah.
And that's how we started the YouTube, which at the end of the day became the big thing for Agro Connection. So that's how we distribute, and it's very organic. We never used advertising tools or anything like that. It's just like people sending to other people. And WhatsApp, which is a software, is becoming more common here in the US. We have 2 WhatsApp groups with about 500 farmers, so 250 in each one. And that's how we distribute. So they make a lot of questions actually every single day about American agriculture and the crop rotation and how you feed the crops and things like that, and cover crops, which is one of my expertise. And we use that channel to connect with farmers.
I've seen some of the videos. They're very Portuguese.
They are.
I didn't understand too much of it. Have you thought about doing some of those in English?
We did. The thing is, as I said, this is not our main job, and it requires a lot of time and energy to do that. So 2021 and 22, so we travel the Midwest 3 times a year. Our first stop was at the Getterman Brothers Family Farms in Bucyrus, Kansas.
Sure.
So that's one of our videos in English with Hayden. So talking about his expectations for the growing season.
Mm-hmm.
And I had research with them on soil health. And then we went from there, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and back to Kansas in 1.5 days.
Wow.
So we interviewed farmers during this trip, and we stopped by fields of corn and soybean, and we recorded videos showing the plants and number of pods and things like that. So 3 times a year to get different stages of the crop, so the Brazilians could know actually what the growing season looked like here in the U.S. And then we did that 3 times in 2021 and 3 times in 2022 as well. So which we call the Agro Connection crop tour.
Yeah.
So, and because of that, the podcast, the videos became like a huge thing. We got videos with like 55,000 views, one video.
Outstanding.
Yeah, no, we were so impressed with that.
It's like a football stadium full of people.
Yeah, and even more because it's agriculture, right?
Yeah.
So,
what feedback do you get on that? I mean, obviously there was demand for the crop tour of the U.S. I mean, what do farmers in Brazil tell you that they're getting out of those videos?
Oh, we got a lot of different things. So when our videos had 8,000 views, it was 100% positive feedbacks on that. So it's good to have people from Brazil in the U.S., students showing the growing season, right? Because there's some noise on what the media will take to Brazil. We know that it's the opposite is also the same.
Mm-hmm.
But then when we got like the 50,000 views, it was very positive and negative. Some people thought we were lying.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So we used to say it's not as bad as people were saying in Brazil, and we were showing the plants, right? So and that was real. But then some people got mad because technically it will change prices, right? And that's when we realized it was big, because it was definitely changing some of the prices of the crops, or some farmers, they were not willing to sell anymore, or things like that.
Yeah.
So it started to interfere in the markets.
You were getting market analysts in your audience.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot. So, and then some happy people and some very mad. So,
yeah, we have the same effect when we do wheat tour here in the U.S.
Yeah.
What kind of information did the Brazilian farmers seek out beyond that crop tour? What kind of information did they want to learn about U.S. agriculture and farmers?
Technologies.
Yeah,
that's number one. So technologies that are used by farmers here. And then they have a lot of interest in soil fertility as well. So they want to know the rates of potassium, the rates of phosphorus and nitrogen, type of application, with the source of application, so time, so several different things, though, that they are very interested in that.
How do they apply that, though, translate that to different soil types?
So that's one of our main jobs, is to make sure they understand we are in a different environment. The cropping system is different. So
much less water,
a lot more snow, and low temperature. So that changes a lot. It's a different soil type. In soil science, we say that these soils are newer. They are not as old as the Brazilian soils that are very weathered. So the red soil, the oxy soils that we have. We try to explain. So in Brazil, they have a soil with a very good physical quality. So very good drainage, aggregation. So if infiltration is high, so the capacity of the soil to soak water is way higher than here in the U.S. But on the other hand, so in the U.S., the soils are richer in potassium and organic matter and things like that. Because in Brazil, you have at least like a median, not warm weather, I would say, and moisture every single day for 365 days of the year, which is different than the U.S. So you burn a lot more organic matter all the time.
What are some of the technologies that maybe we have in the U.S. that your farmers were surprised by or weren't aware of?
It changed a lot. So back in the day, so the U.S. used to have a lot more technologies than the Brazilian farmers had access to. It changed a lot in the last couple of years. But usually a couple of technologies like see and spray that use like artificial intelligence to minimize the use of herbicides or fungicides or things like that. So that's one of them. So it is first tested here, and then it goes to Brazil. But that's probably the new technology that is being developed. In terms of size of tractors and things like that, or combines, Brazil pretty much has the same access of the U.S. agriculture.
So there is a cost associated with doing podcasts and videos. Have you been able to monetize?
Not the podcast. Actually, last year, so the reason we recorded 3 episodes per month on the podcast was because Ford sponsored a couple episodes, and then on the crop tour, yes, so we were able to. But overall, I would say in the podcast, I always spent money from my pocket. Not only mine, but like Alex and Rafael as well. So we spent a lot of money on that. I edited our podcast for 7 or 8 months. And I was also doing my PhD at the same time, so it was very time consuming. And then we started to pay actually my brother to edit the podcast, and then we were just paying him to do that. Overall, I'm sure we spent a lot more money from our pocket than we made with the podcast. But again, the goal is research and extension and some education there. So we never intended to make money with the podcast. And the YouTube, we monetized a little bit because we were doing those crop tours, so we had to rent a car, we had to get a hotel, meals and everything else. So then, so we had a partner, which was the co-op in Brazil, which was a very good fit because they don't have any monetary interest. So they are there to work for farmers. So it was a perfect fit for our goals as well. So they pretty much covered the cost. So make money, I don't know, they covered the cost.
So the podcast is award-winning. Tell us about that award.
Yes. So that was actually after the first year. So there's an award in Brazil that is provided by the journalists. Usually only professionals can be part of that. They have like an open registration, so we registered and a lot of people ended up voting on our podcast, and that was a huge surprise because we were competing with some big media companies. So just like I would just give an example of like Fox or CNN here in the US, some equivalent. So they had their own podcast and YouTube channels. So we got first one on the podcast on that award, and we got second in the videos, and after 1 year of work. So so that really motivated us to keep doing the podcast and also the videos, even though we were kind of spending some of our money for that. But but it was still good. So we really love what we do. Yeah,
that's very rewarding. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
A couple of weeks ago, I was part of a trip that the Kansas Agricultural and Rural Leadership Program organized to Brazil. This was an agriculture education experience, and Agro Connection was the tour company that organized that trip. Carlos, you were the guide on that trip. So obviously the entrepreneur part of you still kicked in. And how did you get from podcast and videos to tour company?
Well, there's a lot of wheat in there. So I like to tell that story because so that was one of our goals, right? I received a couple of groups from Brazil here in the US. That was because they knew about my work here. They wanted to connect with farmers. So we just did that we didn't charge. That was for free. So they connected. So they emailed me and I said, yeah, I can take you to visit a couple of farmers and then take you to Nebraska so you can visit Alex, which is one of my partners on this. And that's what we did. So we did that for 2 groups. And then we thought about bringing Brazilians to the U.S. as a business. But then actually it was the other way around. So I was invited to talk in one of the WheatRx workshops last year in 2023. And then after that meeting, so one of the farmers, Ray Flickner, which is one of the farmers I have a very good relationship. So he said he wanted to go to Brazil with me that year. And I said, well, I'm getting married. So I'm going to have my wedding. I won't have a lot of time. But then, we had that in mind. And then a couple months later, I think, so Ray called me to ask about the trip and the possibility of helping Carl on that trip. And then that's how it started. So we had that idea of doing some type of taking Americans to Brazil or bringing Brazilians to America. And then we just had that opportunity, so it was because of wheat. And actually now I'm doing my postdoc on the WheatRx program with Romulo, and my office is here in the Wheat Innovation Center, so there's a lot of wheat in there. In my state in Brazil, so Rio Grande do Sul, we are the biggest wheat producer as well. So yeah, so there's still a lot of wheat there.
Wheat's on your mind.
Yeah, so. That's true. Yeah.
I just made the producer groan over here. I mean, no experience in that travel game before. I mean, you'd hosted some groups, and so you went out on a limb, and how did you pull it off? I'll have to say, after the event, it was done excellently. And I guess I should ask, the first question is, after the experience, do you want to do it again?
Yeah, we want to. Yeah, there's a new world for Agro Connection there. We are already working with other universities. So a lot of people actually contacted us to ask about the trip and what are the possibilities and itinerary and agenda and things like that. So we are actually talking to other places. We also are developing a trip on our own, which is focused on the use of biologicals in agriculture. So Brazil is one of the leaders in the use of biologicals and the production of biologicals as well, and also regenerative agriculture. So we have a lot of long-term no-till with years and years of cover crops, very healthy soils. So we want to take Americans there and to spend some time. But then it's not tourism, it's education. It's focused on learning more about regenerative agriculture, soil health, and the use of biologicals. So yes. And to put that trip together, so what we did was to have, 1,000 meetings probably. So we had meetings every Tuesday for a long time. And we had to, it was a whole new world for us. Dealing with hotels and dealing with airlines and restaurants and everything else. But we have the passion, and we really believe that we can do whatever we want to. My personality is a little bit of a risk taker, a very motivated person. I love action and challenges, so that was a big one. And then Alex, Rafael, and Ayla, so they were all, Ayla is one of our partners, but then focused more on this trip business. So she was excellent. So she's very efficient, so that helped a lot. So we just wanted to do, and we did it, and maybe this is just a new arena for us for the future.
Do you have intent maybe to flip that and actually host some full Brazilian tours here in the U.S.?
That's a good question. At this moment, probably not. As I said, so this is, again, it's kind of second job for us, right? We know that a big part of the trip is having us as guides. Alex has an experience of more than 10 years here in the U.S. So he was a K-State alumni. He did his master's degree here in soil fertility, his PhD in Nebraska. He had a postdoc in Wisconsin. So he knows the Midwest. I've been here for 7 years. I know the Midwest as well. It's not just a translation, because whenever we were translating information, we were translating in a way that farmers from the Midwest would understand. So I think that's a huge thing, and we cannot travel 3-4 times a year, right? Mm-hmm. Usually we can manage maybe to do 1 or 2. So we want to focus on taking Americans to Brazil, because I think we have that relationship with farmers and other stakeholders here in the U.S. And we have that huge advantage of having that trust and also knowing actually what is important for them rather than just a simple translation.
Having been on the trip, we could certainly tell that you and your colleagues took pride in what you were doing, and I think you'd you do have that advantage in the fact that you can translate that agriculture from an agriculture perspective. It's not just like hiring a third-party translator. I know you were doing a lot of converting from hectares to hectares and kilograms to pounds and things like that, but it did pay off, I think. What did you learn about your own country by doing that trip with taking a bunch of Americans around your country? What did you learn?
A lot. So we actually had a lot of Brazilians wanting to do that trip as well. So they contacted us after that because so what we did with this group was very unique, very, very unique. So we had 4 in-country flights. So we were in 5 different biomes. So Amazon forest, the Brazilian Cerrado, which is the heart of soybean in Brazil nowadays, Pantanal, the tropical forest, and then the Pampa, which is when we start to connect with Argentina and Uruguay. So that was very unique. Before that trip, I knew 3 of those biomes. So this is the first thing, right? And also to see that connection, farmer to farmer, American farmer with a Brazilian farmer, making honest questions, real questions, like real world. So that was very good for me, and also to see how agriculture in Mato Grosso has developed in the last couple of decades, seeing how farmers are doing great there. So they have their own challenges, but they have a lot of different opportunities as well. And also to see that, so the challenges in the US and Brazil, so they exist. Sometimes they are similar, just different degrees. And it was nice to see like an American farmer and a Brazilian farmer talking to each other with our help in the translation, and see that they are worried about pretty much the same things. So that was very important. And even for a Brazilian, that was a very rich trip.
Well, you may have opened Pandora's box, you realize.
Oh, yeah.
We mentioned in the intro here that will start a new job at North Dakota State University, a great position at a great university, but the demand for this travel business you've started might be a competitor with your day job.
Yeah, it might be. But a very important thing here that I actually forgot to mention. So Agro Connection is more than Carlos, Alex, Rafael, and Ayla. So we connect with a lot of Brazilian students here in the US. So I forgot to say that besides the crop tour on YouTube, so we have weekly videos, usually from April to October, so where we talk about the American growing season. And for that, so since we cannot travel every single week, we have Brazilians in other universities. So last year, for example, so we had Brazilians at the Ohio State University, Illinois, Nebraska, K-State, South Dakota State, and Georgia. So we have other Brazilians, other students with a very good background and understanding the agriculture here in the U.S. that will for sure be part of these trips in the future. So just one example, so the other 2 guides, Luis, so he did an internship here at K-State for 1 year. Gustavo, same thing, so he did an internship here. Gustavo's brother did his undergrad in Nebraska, 4 years of Nebraska. So we had a lot of connections there, and I think this is one of the beauties of Agro Connection, because we are also helping students, undergraduate students, to be exposed to extension, to communication, to education, to engage with farmers and really see like the real world, right? So to see real questions that farmers have and how we can address those questions and things like that. So Agro Connection is a network, is more than us, and I think we are ready to make of it a business and also a huge opportunity to connect the U.S. with Brazil.
It is fascinating, that agriculture connection between the U.S. and Brazil. We learned that when we went on the trip. I think at 2 or 3 locations there were people working there who had gone to school at K-State, and in part because you knew them, but still there is a lot of cross-training going on between the 2 countries, and I think that's excellent. The future of Agro Connection, can you do it all? Are you going to continue to do it all?
The podcast, so this is one of my passions, right? You know, as I said, we always do that after 5 p.m. because of our daily job, and so that's when I relax, actually. So in Brazil, I used to play soccer. I can't do much of that here in the U.S.
No.
So what we do is to connect with people, and, you know, we just drink our mate, which is our gaucho tea, and coffee, and we just have that conversation. So that's actually when I relax a little bit. And then the videos, as I said, so Agro Connection is a lot more than only 2 or 3 people. So we have the other students working that. So we were able to manage to have an editor for the video. So we want to do that for a long time and also bring more students, new students to our umbrella so they are able to expose themselves, as I said before. And then the trips, yeah, so that's a very good way actually for education. It's a very important way to engage the US and Brazil. I think the Brazilian farmers can learn a lot with the US, and the US farmers can learn a lot with Brazil as well. So we are very good in different things, and I think that connection is very important. And my position is research and extension, so I will working with farmers a lot, and I think just having that opportunity to take them to Brazil to learn more, and one of the good examples is regenerative agriculture and the use of biologicals. I think that's very important. There's a very important connection there between my new job and also these trips.
As we wrap this up, I've got to ask you the question. You've had exposure to Brazilian farmers and American farmers now over the past several years. What are the similarities and differences between those two groups?
Similarities, I think, is really the concern about profit, right? Just be profitable instead of actually having super high yields or things like that. It's just thinking the profitability. I'm seeing that change here in the US and also in the Brazil. One of the differences based on my experience here in the Midwest, so the family farms, they might be a little bit different. So we visit a family farm in Brazil. They are, we can call them as a family farm, but they were doing like 10 or maybe 8 operations at the same time. So they were planting soybean, they were harvesting corn, they were liming, they were spraying, they were spreading potash, they were chopping corn stalks, and they were spraying with the airplane. So a lot of things at the same time. I think the labor is a huge difference. Although labor is also a problem in Brazil, not as much maybe as my experience here in the US showed me. So I think these are probably the main things there, and the similarities is finding that farmers are always very welcoming. So I'm an international, and I worked 100% of my time with farmers here in Kansas on that network. Just enough, someone that I learned a lot over time, and I actually got these farmers to sign my dissertation because they were probably the most important piece of my degree here. So the Gettermans, Mike Jordan, Doug Palin, Ray Flickner. So just a couple of examples of these farmers that I was able to connect here in the US and learn a lot with them. And when I was in Brazil, I also connected with farmers and I learned a lot from them as well. Best day for me here was when I was at a farm. So the farmer just got his truck and we drove about 2 hours around the farm, and he was just explaining the entire operation to me. So that was probably one of the best days of my life. And this is what I'm going to take from Kansas probably. So how friendly they were, and then they were not only worried about their own field, but also with my education. So that was pretty good.
Agro Connection seems like a very appropriate name. I'm glad you chose that. People want to learn more about Agro Connection. What's your website?
agroconnection.net, N-E-T, so it's www.agroconnection.net. So that is
in English.
That is in English, yep. So that's easy to find. We are going to come up with a new website, 100% in English, because of these trips that we were planning to organize and to help Americans to get there. So that's coming soon. And we also have our Instagram X account, which is at Agro Connection. So that's easy to find. We have a couple episodes in English. Chuck Rice is one of them. So on YouTube, we have a couple interviews with farmers as well from Kansas, Nebraska. So, and the idea there was not actually to do that for Americans, but actually for Brazilians that want to learn English, always with that education background. So behind the scenes. So we always want to be focusing on that.
Well, Carlos, thanks for facilitating the exchange of information. I think it's very important, and best of luck to you and your whole team with Agro Connection.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think I can say that I completed my degree at Kansas in a happy way. So just being in a Kansas podcast, that's very meaningful for someone that is not from Kansas and was a student a couple months ago. So I think that's very important. And the opportunity to talk about Agro Connection, that was actually, it was a side thing, a kind of a hobby, but still it was very important for my degree as I am a research and extension person. So that was always connected in some way, and connection is everywhere.
It is, and I think that's going to be a big deal for you. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Carlos Pires for joining us on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. If you have a question to follow up on this episode, please email us at podcast@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.